But first, this has been a month for us to all lose faith in politics in Australia. In Victoria, there's been the disastrous bungling of the coronavirus crisis by Premier Daniel Andrews and his government, led directly to the deaths of about 800 people. And there's been what increasingly looks like a cover-up that today caused an inquiry into Victoria's quarantine hotels disaster to all but admit it had been hoodwinked. More about that sensational development in a minute. And in New South Wales, we've meanwhile seen Premier Gladys BEREJIKLIAN claim she never noticed that her boyfriend, himself an MP, was using his influence and his office as a politician to sell visas to foreigners and to make land deals with developers, particularly around the Badgerys Creek airport development. And to get some sympathy, she's even sold herself even to shock jocks like Carl and Sandilands and Jackie O as the poor victim of love, of a man who'd done her wrong. For heaven's sake, she even answered the questions about whether she'd had a lesbian affair. I mean, gee, how much do you have to prostrate yourself to? Anyway, federally today, more reason to despair about politics. The Morrison government came under more fire about a dodgy land deal of its own, and again involving Badgerys Creek. The government, for some unknown reason, spent $30 million for this land near the new airport development from Liberal donors, a land that turned out to be worth just $3 million, 1/10 of the purchase price. Badgerys Creek sure seems a honeypot for developers, doesn't it? What's more, the head of the infrastructure department said he'd only referred this astonishing deal to police after the Auditor-General had looked at it, denounced it and called in the police themselves.
At which point we were informed that the AFP were already investigating after the ANAO had referred it.
Well, the police say it's early days in their investigations, but
I think it's important to note we would describe the investigation at an early juncture, very much an assessment phase. The ANAO has provided additional material to the AFP, which we're working through the process of assessing that material. We haven't identified any criminality in relation to the investigation at this stage. We've probably got more of a focus on 142, which is corruption of public officials. It's an offence that we'll assess.
Former Nationals leader Barnaby Joyce today said heads should roll over this one, but the government won't be offering a politician's head, you can be sure of that. Paul Fletcher, who was the infrastructure minister at the time, used the Dan Andrews defence. You know how it goes. Some public service made this decision to spend that $30 million. I knew nothing. They should have referred it. They didn't refer it to me. Honestly. And the Deputy Prime Minister today defended a claim that he'd made that the government might actually have made a good deal out of this.
What I said was, in time, when we look back at this and we say, well, at least the land next to the Western Sydney Airport is Commonwealth owned. It will cost a lot more in the future had it not been bought now.
Look, I don't know whether we're talking corruption here, but it's like I say with the Dan Andrews government. Why do we have ministers, when they leave such big calls to public servants without even asking what the hell? $30 million for this scrap of land, no questions asked? That's your money, you know. But when it comes to mismanagement, you just cannot go past the Victorian government. And the question now is it not just guilty of causing the deaths of 800 people, but of covering up? Extraordinary scenes today. The inquiry this government called it just one, only one of them, of the worst mistakes it's made in this virus crisis. That's the inquiry into why on earth it got private security guards and not professionals like the police or like the army to guard Victoria's quarantine hotels. Now, hiring those guards was bizarre. Many were poorly trained, many hired through WhatsApp, many with language problems or religious objections to alcohol-based sanitisers. Some got sick, inevitably, and they spread the virus, and away it went. So who made that call for private security guards? In fact, who thought, yes, let's hire most of those guards from a small New South Wales company, Unified Security, that's had a troubled financial past, that isn't a preferred tenderer, but it does claim to be Indigenous owned because this is the owner, the man who says he identifies as Aboriginal. But so much about this inquiry was odd from the start. Why was it so limited? The Andrews government Its contact tracing was also appalling. The protection of aged care facilities, appalling. 80% of the victims died there. Why weren't these mistakes also investigated? And why were key witnesses not asked to give evidence? And why did the inquiry wrap in just a couple of weeks ago, so it thought, finished, without having got to the bottom of the one question it was supposed to answer? Who said, let's hire private security? Oh, council's assistant said, oh, well, look, actually, forget it. No one actually decided to hire private security, even though the Premier himself had mentioned they'd be involved back in March. No one made that call. It was just a creeping assumption. Creeping assumption. Even the former Health Minister, Jenny Mikakos, who quit after giving her evidence, said that was a nonsense finding, and the inquiry should treat Andrew's evidence that he knew nothing with caution. I don't know why she didn't use the word lie, but there you go, with caution, much safer. It seems to me that no one here has really been busting a gut to get to the truth, and now it's blown up in the face of this inquiry, led by former Judge Jennifer Coates. Today was an embarrassment. The inquiry people, they must have felt caught out being slack or being too credulous or being misled. I mean, one, its main counsel assisting said, now it knew the mystery caller, now it knew who'd rung the then Police Chief Commissioner on March 22, the very moment that the Police Chief switched from not knowing who'd be guarding their hotels to knowing it would be private security. That caller, that mystery caller, turns out to be the Premier's head of the department. And how did the inquiry now know this? Not through its own findings, but because Sky News' Peter Credlin had confronted the Premier a week and a half ago about the phone records of his staff. Why weren't they handed over to see who made that call? They were then handed over, and voila, it was Eccles, the Premier's right-hand man, who quit. 2, the inquiry now realises the Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, didn't tell it the facts, the truth, has some explaining to do. Like so many in this government, he was claiming at the inquiry he never knew that private guards were going to do the hotel security. Not until it blew up in the media. That's the first he knew. Now the inquiry has found emails that were in the papers last week showing Sutton thanking a health official in March for telling him private security was in fact in charge. And Sutton now has 7 days from the inquiry to do a please explain.
Those assisting you are in the process of seeking a response in the form of an affidavit from Professor Sutton to specific questions posed by the board and focusing on those emails. According to the statutory requirements, that response will be due some 7 days after it is served.
And the third embarrassment, the inquiry now knows that emails like these and a couple of others it's now got wind of were not handed over by the Victorian Health Department as requested by the inquiry. And so the department too must now hand over a please explain its excuse for withholding evidence.
DHHS's solicitors advised, in the context of a review of up to 500,000 documents, the enclosed documents were not considered relevant to a notice to produce. In the view of those assisting you, Madam Chair, this document on its face goes to matters which occupied a very considerable amount of the board's time, and you may consider it adds some weight in one direction or another to your deliberations as to who was in charge of the detention regime.
In fact, 3 other people as well as Sutton have to write back to the inquiry with their explanations about why certain things don't seem to hang together. Graham Eccles, the former Police Chief Graham Ashton, the head of the Health Department. And I would have thought that after all this, all these embarrassments, the inquiry today would have hit the roof. Instead, the counsel assisting was saying, well, look, we're not actually accusing anyone of lying here.
There is accordingly no basis for inferring or even speculating that any view has been formed about the veracity or otherwise of the evidence previously given by any parties on the topic of the engagement of private security.
Well, that was a nice little thought. And the inquiry boss said she wasn't even sure yet if she's going to need to make so many more inquiries that she'll miss the deadline next month for reporting. She'll just wait and see, she says. Does this look like a fair dinkum inquiry to you?